Boris Worm, Professor of Marine Biology at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada.
And what got you into all this?
You know, I've always had a passion for water and life, and so what do? I study water, life and water, right? I can say that again. So I've always had a passion for water and for life, so I study life contained in water. So I became a marine biologist. And what got me into this was that I became curious about individual animals, and then in order to understand how they are doing, you really need to understand the broader ecosystem, and in order to understand the broader ecosystem, you really need to look at the whole planet. And that's where I'm at now.
Looking at the whole planet?
Looking at the whole planet, particularly the ocean planet, and how that's changing, what that has to do with us, and how we can do a better job.
Okay. Well, what's your favorite species in the ocean?
Favorite species in the ocean is the bull shark, because it's the most impressive animal I've ever seen underwater.
They're pretty cool. I swam with them in, near Playa del Carmen in Mexico.
Yeah. Kind of the opposite to that would be the pygmy seahorse, which is so small that you would always mistake it for a piece of dirt on a coral.
Is that a nod?
Yeah, that's early trying to come in.
Okay. Did I tell you we're doing a pygmy seahorse movie?
Nope.
It's called Dragon Reef. It's a 3D IMAX movie.
Uh-huh.
It's basically the life cycle of the pygmy seahorse.
Right.
So the story is, this baby seahorse lives its entire life on a rare species of coral called
Right.
Marcella.
Right.
They've got a beautiful life. They communicate with each other. Everything's great, except when they're born, all the babies get swept out to sea,
Oh yeah.
and 90+% of them die.
Mm.
But from the time they're born, all they try to do is find their way back to the coral that they can't live without.
Mm-hmm.
And if they make it, they find a mate they keep for life, and the guy gets pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
So we're shooting it mostly in tanks on joysticks in on Lizard Island in Australia.
Cool.
Yeah, you'll have to come to the set.
Oh,
Check it out.
they're lovely. I saw them first time in Indonesia,
Yeah.
and yeah, they're a favorite for sure.
Yeah, they're super cool. So what's been the focus of your most recent studies?
So recently, I'm really trying to understand how the ocean works and how those workings are affected by people. What the ocean does for us and how we're affecting that, how it affects human well-being. Focusing on large fish and the change in abundance in large fish. We found that on average, about 90% of exploited large fish have been depleted, and most notably sharks, which have disappeared from parts of the ocean, like large parts of the Mediterranean, large parts of the Caribbean, other places that have been exploited for a long time. Tuna and billfish, other large fishes. Cod off this coast, which have declined 99.9% in some cases. It's a long list of species that have disappeared from some areas and virtually disappeared from others. And a lot of them were now concerned for their continued survival. And I'm interested in how that could happen and how to reverse that, and what are the ecosystem consequences of that. So that brought me to look at the larger ecosystem and the base of the ecosystem, which is the base for everything in the ocean, which is phytoplankton. And we've recently looked at global trends in phytoplankton over the past 100 years, finding that when you look at all the data together, you see that phytoplankton levels in 8 out of 10 ocean regions are dropping precipitously, most notably in the North Atlantic and North Pacific, but also in other ocean regions like Antarctica, really around the planet. And on average, we found that up to 40% of the phytoplankton had disappeared over the past century. And we attributed this to the effect of ocean warming and climate change.
And is 40% a big deal in phytoplankton?
Well, 40% it's the same as you would log or make disappear 40% of all grasses, trees, shrubs, and other plants on land. So it's quite a proportion.
And why should we care about phytoplankton?
Phytoplankton is important because it's the base of everything in the ocean, and the ocean is the base for everything on the planet. Life originated in the ocean, and it's the most essential part of our life support system. Every second breath we take comes from the ocean. Half of the oxygen we breathe is produced there. Half of the biomass that's produced through the photosynthesis is produced in the ocean. So it's a big deal of what this planet is about.
And what does phytoplankton do specifically?
So phytoplanktons, they're the plants of the ocean. They use sunlight and carbon and build it into materials that are then passed up the food chain, ultimately onto large fish, whales, and humans.
And if the trend in phytoplankton continues, what's going to happen?
Well, if this depletion of phytoplankton would say that again. So if this depletion of phytoplankton would continue, it would basically starve the ocean, because it's the food source for everything that lives in the ocean.
Wow. And what's that going to mean for our oxygen?
It's hard to say what that will mean for oxygen, because the phytoplankton, when it's sinking down, it also consumes oxygen, so there's a balance between production and consumption. It's hard to tell, but we're already seeing that the oxygen content of parts of the ocean is decreasing as well. It's called the deoxygenation of the ocean. It's a recent trend that's attributed also to climate change, increasing stratification of the water, and possibly it also has something to do with declining phytoplankton levels. So there's less oxygen in the ocean, which means less oxygen in the biosphere.
Can you give me a little bit of an example of how climate change is affecting the oceans?
Okay, so climate change is affecting the ocean in many ways, some of which we can already observe. For example, the bleaching of coral reefs and the dying off of corals. We do see that. We see probably the largest migration ever of ocean animals from warmer waters into cooler waters, as those are warming as well. So an expansion of the tropical and subtropical waters into cooler waters, a diminishing of ice in the Arctic, with the associated habitat for marine life there. What it does in the open ocean is that it warms surface waters in a way that they're sitting more stable on the cooler, deeper subsurface waters. It's like a lake in the summer that warms up and the warm water sits on top. And if that water becomes warmer, it sits on top in a more stable way. And that reduces the rate at which nutrients are mixed into those surface water where really ocean life is happening and where most of the phytoplankton live that depend on those nutrients. So in a sense, a warmer ocean is a less nutrient-rich ocean in the surface waters, and so it's an ocean that increasingly becomes starved.
And that's going to have huge consequences.
Well, yes, if this continues, it really means that those effects will filter up the food chain, and there will be less food to go around for ocean life in general.
And less food for people.
And less food for people in the end. And that's the other side of the coin, is that we're also diminishing our food supply from the top of the food chain. So we're seeing these effects of climate change on the bottom of the food chain that are possibly diminishing the base of the food web, but also we're slicing off the top of the food web by overfishing, which is a global problem that has really accelerated dramatically over the last 50 years with the industrialization of global fisheries, such that today there's really no place on the planet anymore that's not impacted by the effects of fishing. I had friends who were discovering new ecosystems, entire new ecosystems off the coast of New Zealand with chemosynthetic organisms that are doing new things, producing new forms of energy. They were very excited about this discovery. They saw new species of fish, but already that place had been impacted by fishing. They saw trawl marks, they saw lost fishing gear, and big impacts on that ecosystem as it was discovered. So it's a little bit akin to rainforest, where you're losing some of the species and some of the habitats before you can even describe them.
Can you give me the numbers on where you've seen plankton go in like 1 or 2 sentences?
So we have documented that plankton levels are declining on a global scale in 8 out of 10 large ocean ecosystems. So basically everywhere with the exception of the Indian Ocean, where plankton levels are either stable or increasing. Also, we saw plankton levels increasing in the immediate coastal waters, but most of the ocean is open ocean, and there we see the diminishing of plankton levels.
And could you say our studies have found that plankton levels have dropped by X% in X amount of years?
Sure, yeah. So our study has found that phytoplankton levels have diminished by up to 40% over the last 50 years, so since 1950, in 8 out of 10 ocean regions.
Awesome. And if you were to, what was the most startling fact or startling number or startling decline or anything that you found in all of your studies of world's fisheries?
Well, in all of our studies of world fisheries, we've seen this continuous trend of collapse of fish stocks. No matter how you slice or dice the data, with every year there's a higher proportion of fish stocks collapse. Not in every region, but globally for sure. And to us, this showed that there would be a point in the future where we could run out of seafood if this trend was to continue.
And you guys found numbers that if the trend continues, we're going to hit this number? What were your findings on that?
Yeah, well, again, that's so caveated now, because I actually don't believe anymore that this trend will continue. We're seeing signs of flattening off in a lot of regions, but we're also seeing the displacement of fishing efforts to other regions. So originally we predicted that if this trend of species collapse through fisheries and overfishing would continue, we could run out of seafood supply in the year 2048. Since then, we've seen that we're increasingly in a divided world where some places are stabilizing or even recovering due to proper management, but much of the world lacks that management capacity to really turn things around. This is much of the developing world, much of the high seas.
In terms of studies of large predator populations, can you tell me about a little quick summary of where your study went on that?
So we have comprehensively studied the decline and depletion of large predator populations, sharks, tuna and billfish, large groundfish such as cod and halibut, even whales, pinnipeds, manatees, everything there, large predators in the ocean in general. What we found, looking at the results of over 100 studies, 250 different historical records of large predator populations, is that on average, 89% of the populations had been depleted. So this means that over the last 50 to 100 years, we've greatly diminished the top of the food chain in the oceans as a whole, not just in individual regions, but in the ocean as a whole.
I don't understand as much. 89% of them have been depleted. So is that like 89% of species have gone down, or species have gone down?
On average, okay, I can say this again. So by compiling 250 records from over 100 studies, we found that large predator populations, on average, had declined nearly 90%. Some were doing better, some were doing worse. In some cases, they were completely wiped out. In others, they had only declined 50 or 60%, but the average was 90% for those exploited large predator populations, including sharks, tuna, billfish, large groundfish, whales, seals, manatees, sea turtles even. Everything large that you can find in the ocean has been depleted, on average, by almost 90%.
And if those trends continue, and our fishing continues as it's going, when do you think we're going to be out of fish?
I think now, honestly, that we're not going to run out of fish globally. We're going to run out of fish in a number of regions, and that will happen at different points in time. This region here has run out of large fish basically in the early 1990s, and they're only now starting slowly to recover. Now we're fishing invertebrates, things like crabs and shrimps and sea cucumbers and so on. But the large fish have declined, in some cases 99.9% over the historical baseline. We're managing tiny remnants of what was once there. Other places, like the Central Pacific, are better managed, and you still have fairly large fish populations there. And places like Alaska have a large and well-managed supply of fish. So there's regional differences there, but different places will run out at different times. And my fear is that those places that rely most on a stable seafood supply, particularly coastal developing nations, small island nations, will run out before others do. And this will compromise the survival of the people in those countries.
It seems like a bit of a perfect storm. Phytoplankton's going down, pollution's going up, all the big fish are gone. what are we gonna do? You know?
I think we have to accept that the ocean is changing very rapidly, and that this has in large part to do with our actions and also the things we don't do. If we continue to increase carbon dioxide level, the ocean will become more acidic, less oxygenated, lower in phytoplankton, and there will simply be less life in the ocean to support the fundamental ecosystem processes that have been going on for millions of years. If we want to stop that, I think we have to address overfishing, ocean pollution, and climate change simultaneously. So it's not about fixing one problem and not caring about the rest. It's really about addressing the whole, which is we're taking out too much of the ocean, and we're pumping waste products in that don't belong there, including the carbon dioxide that we emit, that is acidifying the ocean and contributing to climate change and the decline of plankton and the deoxygenation of the ocean.
Do you think we're causing a major extinction?
I think we have the powers of causing a major extinction event in the ocean. I think it's fair to say that we're not there yet. Extinction rates in the ocean are still fairly low, as far as we know. But they could increase dramatically in the future. For example, large pelagic sharks, some of the most abundant predators of the planet previous to human exploitation, are now one of the most threatened species on the planet. 1 in 2 pelagic sharks is threatened by extinction according to IUCN. 1 of 3 sharks in total, including the coastal species. To me, that's just inconceivable, that large parts of the ocean that used to teem with sharks used to be completely controlled by these predators for millions of years, for longer than the dinosaurs have lived, are now practically free of sharks. And that's certainly changing the ecosystem in ways that we're only beginning to understand now.
How is it changing the ecosystem?
Well, in places that have lost sharks and other large predators, we're always seeing an increase in smaller species that then can cause cascading ripple effects throughout the food chain. We're also seeing behavioral changes in species. So turns out it's not just what you eat, but also what you scare away that's affecting the ecosystem. May sound funny, but a lot of the effects of sharks and other predators, like wolves on land, it's the same thing, come through scaring certain animals out of particular habitats such that they cannot cause damage to those habitats. And that's an important part of the balancing effects the large predators have on the ecosystem. It's through what they eat, but also through the behavioral effects they have.
So what are some of the changes you guys have seen?
Well, some of the changes that have been studied in more detail include large increases in so-called mesopredators that then can cause cascading effects on shellfish species, for example. Collapses of bay scallop populations in the eastern US have been attributed in part to a proliferation of smaller mesopredators that are not sufficiently suppressed anymore by the presence of large sharks that used to be abundant and are not anymore of those ecosystems. We've seen overgrazing of seagrass meadows, for example, in Shark Bay, appropriately named in Western Australia, at times when sharks are not present or diminished in numbers. There's other changes that we're observing, like large increases in jellyfish populations around the world that are partly linked to pollution and partly possibly linked to overfishing. So we're seeing these really kind of drastic and ongoing ecosystem changes, not just in here and there, but throughout the world oceans. And we're really scrambling to trying to understand why this is happening and what's caused by overfishing, what's caused by pollution, what's caused by climate change, and what's caused by a combination of those. What we're finding is that an ocean that's polluted and overfished, for example, tends to be more vulnerable to environmental changes. An ocean that still has its full range of species and healthy populations can buffer some of the effects of climate variability and change. So we're seeing that these effects tend to compound each other, and that's cause for concern.
So being a scientist and knowing all of these stats and knowing human population, increasing affluence, China, where we're going, what kind of a picture have you got in your mind of where we're going?
Well, my fear is that we're going towards a place that simply doesn't support the amount of life that the planet used to support. I mean, in the end, it is our life support system in a little way. We're part of that life. And if we're diminishing the basis of that ecosystem, there will be less to go around for everybody, including humans. So the fear is that it's a place that has fewer species and less of them, including ourselves. The hope is that I've been to places where people have changed the way they manage resources and they conduct themselves in the ocean. And it comes down to being more mindful about what you take out and just treating that place in a whole different way. For example, when I was in Raja Ampat, they set up these large protected areas and had a ban on shark fishing and finning. And we're studying very closely how the ocean around them was changing and behaving, and adjusting their ways of fishing and managing the ocean accordingly. And what really struck me about that was how people, from school children to fishermen to everybody who lived in that area, was really engaged in the well-being of the ocean, really understanding that the ocean essentially is responsible for their well-being or their demise. And to me that was powerful to see how that was incorporated and then translated into concrete actions.
What would you tell the general public about what you found and what they should be doing?
I mean, what all of our research has shown is that the ocean is not limitless, and that the ocean is a very fragile place that has already been compromised by overfishing, by climate change, and by the effects of pollution. And that those effects continue to accelerate in many places around the world. And we need to address these threats simultaneously, curb overfishing, make the restoration of marine ecosystems a central management dogma, basically. That it's not the question how much can we take out, but how much can we get back. And to me that's not just in the ocean, but as a planet as a whole. We really need to shift that mindset from taking as much as we can to giving back.
Do you have any particular anecdotes about sailfish, or any population numbers and where sailfish have gone? Or billfish in general?
Well, we just recently published a study that for the first time looked at the distribution of tuna and billfish on a global scale. The question was, as they're diminishing in numbers, are they only also found in fewer places? So is their range contracting? Much like wolves were found in all of North America 100 years ago, and now they're only found in small pockets and in northern Canada. We found the same was true for tuna and billfish. Of 13 populations we looked at, 9 had significantly diminished in their range, so the distribution had shrunken. One of them was sailfish, another one was white marlin. A lot of the large marlins had declined in their abundance and in their range, and a lot of the tuna is the same. Species that expanded in abundance, like skipjack tuna, have also expanded in their range. Sailfish actually also expanded in the Pacific, but declined in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. So what we're finding is what we call a double jeopardy, that species that are threatened by low numbers are also threatened again by that they're found in fewer places, that their available habitat has declined.
And is that just because they need each other to find mates and to hunt and stuff?
It probably has to do with the elimination of subpopulations. So there are certain populations in certain areas that only live there, and once you've wiped them out, they're not found in that area anymore. The other is that as a species becomes less numerous, they tend to contract to the places that are most beneficial to their survival. And as they're becoming more numerous, they expand into suboptimal habitats, like us moving from nice places to not so nice places because the nice places are crowded. Same idea.
It sounds like all of these problems are, from my perspective, very soon going to threaten human survival. Why haven't we done anything about it yet? Like, why are fisheries still going in this direction, or have we done something about it?
Well, certainly the problem with overfishing has been fully recognized now, and a lot of places are starting to turn around and trying to manage fisheries better. The question is whether it happens fast enough to save a lot of the species that have declined greatly in numbers, like sharks, from being further wiped out and possibly driven to extinction for some species. But we do find that increasingly people are setting up marine protected areas. They're trying to find new ways of engaging fishermen in the conservation of species rather than in the overexploitation of species. And they are thinking about the effects of particular fishing gears and trying to limit the use of destructive fishing gears in certain areas. All of that is going on. So far, I find there's more talk about it than actual action. And where there's action, we often find that there's a displacement of that destructive fishing effort to other regions. So as long as the world is not moving forward as a whole, we can still have some of those destructive or polluting industries move to other places. And that's a concern for sure. But overall, I see that there's a lot of growth and awareness that the oceans are in trouble and that something needs to be done. And that also this can't go on unchecked into the future.
Where do you find the greatest amount of hope in all this?
What gives me the greatest amount of hope, honestly, is that I see that more and more people are concerned about this. There's a huge tide of interest in the ocean and in ocean conservation that wasn't there 10 or 15 years ago to the same extent. The oceans are not seen as limitless anymore. A lot of people are aware that their personal choices of what fish they eat, which kind of fisheries they support, what they throw into the garbage, which ends up in the ocean at some point, how that's affecting the oceans as a whole, and how they individually can change, how they can make choices that support the planet rather than further diminish our life support system. And to me, that growing awareness and that mindfulness is increasing very rapidly, particularly among younger people, I find.
But like individual choices can't really make that big a difference, isn't it all just governments and corporations?
No, I think, for example, the whole seafood industry is turning over right now to support sustainable fisheries and try to phase out fish products from illegal fishing or unsustainable fisheries. This is something that's happening not just here and there. It's a broad movement across, particularly the Western world, but increasingly becoming a global movement, driven by large retailers, which are conscious now that people make choices about the types of fish they consume, and that if they have, say, sharks on their menu or deep water fish like orange roughy, which live up to 150 years and are basically mined out of the ocean rather than fished in a sustainable manner, that if they offer those products, they are branding themselves as an unsustainable company. And more companies are aware of this and really driving a very rapid change in how fish are sourced and the transparency of where that fish comes from and how it was caught. I see massive change there happening very rapidly, driven by individual consumer choices.
What are some of the measures that should be taken to ensure we don't destroy all our fisheries?
To curb overfishing, there's not a panacea. That there's not one thing we can do and we're saved. Certainly, changes to the fishing gear we use, changes to how we manage the ocean spatially. So, I'll say that again. So there's not a panacea, there's not a silver bullet, the one thing you can do to save the ocean. It needs to be a combination of measures to curb overfishing through large closed areas, protected areas, changes to the fishing gear, and changes to the amount of fish that's allowed to be taken out of the ocean. There needs to be a strategy to recover fish stocks that have been depleted rather than driving them down further and further. And hard targets and timelines for how to achieve that. And in the United States, for example, that's presently happening. There are laws that prevent overfishing and that make the rebuilding of fish populations to healthy level mandatory. It's not a choice, it's a necessity. And increasingly, that's becoming the mindset around the world on how to change that and how to achieve that.
Do you purposely try to be hopeful or optimistic?
Well, by nature, I'm a hopeful person because I do believe from my own life and from what I see around me that people, individuals, can really make a difference and really change the way we think about things and we conduct ourselves. So that makes me hopeful. Sometimes when I look at the data and I study trends in fish populations and ocean resources, and so I feel quite desperate. But I do see lots of reasons to believe that we can, in principle, change, and we have changed in important ways, and we will continue to change. And this, I believe now, is something that's driven almost entirely by what individuals are choosing to do or not to do. It's not something magic that comes from the heavens or from politicians. It's something that each individual needs to embrace.
Something that gave me a really positive, good butterflies in my stomach was Isla Mujeres in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Went diving with found a place that was only discovered a couple of years ago. 300 whale sharks in an area the size of a football field.
300.
300.
No way.
Yeah. Like, I've got footage of it. It's like you 50 boats, 50 Mexican boats, hucking people in the water, and just people are getting bowled out of the water, lifted out of the water by whale sharks.
Wow.
Like, you can see it from the air, everywhere you look, fins, fins, fins.
Yeah. So to me, what also gives me hope is when I actually go out on the ocean and I sail across the Pacific, and you put out lights at night and you see the amount of life that comes up. The ocean is so alive. It's certainly not dead or dying. It's a very, very alive place. You see squid, you see tiny fish coming up from 1,000-meter depth to feed at the surface at night. You see larger fish preying on them. It's an incredibly alive and resilient place. So that gives me hope. But also I see how that place is changing and how the base of the food web is diminishing, how the top of the food chain is being compromised, and that concerns me. But the ocean certainly is still alive, and I really hope we keep it that way.
Do you know any numbers on like what percentage of the population eats fish or gets protein from fish, or people that depend on the oceans for food or anything like that?
So there's hundreds of millions of people who depend on fish as their major source of protein, particularly in developing and island nations. On average, each one of us eats about 15 kilograms per year of seafood and other fish products. But that can be as high as 100 kilograms in some countries and as low as close to nothing in some landlocked countries. So it really depends on where you are. But it is an enormously important part of our food supply. And it's something that's provided by nature, in a sense, for free, as long as we treat it properly. And it's organic. It's not full of pesticides and antibiotics and so on. I think it should be seen as something as a health food product, a gift from nature, if you will, that we need to do something to continue to enjoy.
So, if the fisheries continue, if things collapse, can we not, is humanity not going to be fine? Can we not just go and make more chickens and cows?
Well, I don't even want to think about the world where all the fish have collapsed, because I think we would lose just part of what makes this planet unique and habitable to us. Yes, we could make more chickens at a huge environmental cost, because producing chicken is a lot more environmentally damaging than eating sustainable seafood out of the ocean.
Japan, do you know any numbers on their consumption of fish?
Well, I know that they are in the 70 to 100 kilogram range per person per year. Yeah.
A lot of fish consumption.
A lot of fish consumption throughout Asia. Yeah. But also through large parts of Europe.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Any numbers or stats on fish populations and how fish is doing in Papua New Guinea?
Well, I went to West Papua last year, and it was you saw the effect. It was very easy to see the effects of the destructive fishing, dynamite fishing, and bomb fishing, as it's called, and poison fishing, and sharks in particular were particularly depleted. But at the same time, I saw that people were setting up networks of large protected areas. They were changing the ways they were managing and assessing fish stocks. They were protecting some of the larger predators. There was no fishing of sharks anymore. Sea turtles were protected. And there was a lot of education going on for kids in the area to change the way they perceive the ocean. They see themselves as part of the ocean. This is the most biodiverse place on the planet. There's more species of fish and corals in that area of West Papua than anywhere else on the planet. And the people there now really realize this as their gift and their heritage, and something they need to actively protect, and something they can actually maintain and keep around for the future. I think fundamentally there's a lot of us. There's more people on the planet than any other large species probably in the history of the planet. Our combined biomass is something like 350 million tons, or 4 times the total fish catch of the planet. Is just the sheer mass of people on the planet. It's just a lot to bear. And there is this perception that if not our population, but our consumption can grow and grow and grow in some way into the indefinite future. And clearly we're already exhausting the capacity of the planet to provide for us at our current level of population and consumption. So that gap will only widen in the future. And to me, the most important steps are to stabilize the world population and hopefully, encourage that we're going back to a sustainable level, to make sure that the services that ecosystem provide to us in terms of food and fiber and clean water and clean air and productive soil and all of these functions that are essential to our well-being, that they're maintained. And this is something that's up to us. It's not something that happens magically. It's something that we can actually scientifically assess and manage and make decisions on whether to go the one way or the other way. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to have, in a sense, a cold, hard look at what the consequences are of our choices. Sometimes I feel as a species we're like teenagers who haven't really grasped the concept of consequences yet. I do this, this happens. And as a scientist, I feel it's my obligation to make those consequences seen and heard, not just by decision makers, but by people as a whole, because everybody has a stake in this, and everybody is affected by what's happening to the planet. And everybody needs to be part of that change.
Yeah, it seems like all this would be fine if we had, 1 billion people. We could burn or whatever.
Well, we could still, we would still irreparably harm the planet with 1 billion people, I believe, if we just try hard enough. But it would be easier with 1 billion people than with 7 billion people. But guess what? We are 7 billion, and we will continue to grow. We can't change that. So the question is, given that amount of people, how can we make sure that we don't wreck the planet in the process? And I'm sure we can.
Why is it a given that we're going to grow, though? Why do we have to grow? Why can't we just stop growing? Why can't we stop building? Why can't we stop?
Well, we have what's called a demographic bubble, right? That there's a lot of young people like ourselves on this planet that still a lot of them will bear children, and just if you add up the numbers, that population will still grow. It's in my country, in Germany, and large parts of Europe and parts of North America, so the population is already declining because people are choosing to have fewer children. That's causing a host of problems by itself to local economies, but for the planet as a whole, obviously, it's a good thing. But it's not just the numbers of people, it's also what they do, the amount of affluence and the consumption patterns we have and the technology we use, right? Whether we drive an SUV or an electric bike is a choice we have to get from A to B. And that choice of technology obviously hugely affects our impact. Whether we fish with hook and line or with a trawl net that's dragged across the ocean is a simple choice in technology, how we get at that food supply. Whether we farm industrially or organically is a choice in technology we have. And then as consumers, we ask ourselves every time. I think individually we have two important resources to spend. One is the time we have, which is very limited, and the money we have. And how do we spend our time and how do we spend our money? To me, it comes down to that. And I've made a personal commitment to try to spend it in a way that I'm at least balancing my impacts. Because just by living, I'm consuming things, I'm going to places, I'm consuming fossil fuels and food and everything else. But I can also make a positive difference through my work and through the way I support certain causes and not others. And my hope is that in the end I will come out with a positive balance sheet. And I think if everybody would at least try to do that, we would be in a better state. To me, it is very personal.
Well, what kind of words of encouragement could you give to people? Like, how do we get other people to want to look at the world the way you do, to want to protect things, to want to be involved instead of shopping?
I think people are really hungry to do something that makes sense, rather than doing things that are simply done for distraction. I get lots and lots of phone calls from people who want to do something positive, something constructive, particularly young people. In the end, we want to live our life in a way that makes sense, right? And that hopefully makes our life and life of others better rather than worse. And I think a lot of our culture is a little devoid of meaning these days, and and there's a lot of meaningful things to be done. And to me, working towards a healthier planet and a better relationship between people and the environment is about the most meaningful thing you can do, not just for the planet but for people as well, and for individuals.
I heard a stat yesterday that the number one favorite pastime of young girls in North America, of 98% of young girls, is shopping.
Right. Yeah, that's the culture. So the culture is that the more we get, the happier we are. And the real picture is not at all like that. Like, if you have ever been to developing countries, you see that people on average don't tend to be less happy.
More even.
Yeah. And particularly kids, I find, they're tend to be very resourceful and very content and happy. If they have the basics for survival, right? But whether we need all this stuff around us is, I think, questionable. But it's the mental model right now, and I think that's what we need to change. Yeah.
We talked briefly earlier about being separate from nature.
Mm-hmm.
If you could give people watching this like a brief on why we're not separate from nature, what would you tell them?
Well, I think one of the problems we're facing is that we see ourselves separate from nature, and we see it as a duality. Here's people and here's nature, and people are ruining nature, or nature is fighting back in some ways, like an antagonistic relationship. But really, we're part of nature. Fundamentally, we're another species on this planet that depends on this planet just as much as the whales do and the birds do and the insects do. We're just one of them. We have an enormously large population that's putting a lot of stress on the planet. So we're depending on it, in a sense, even more than we used to. And to me, there's only one way forward, which is that people start to take care of the planet as their life support system, as something that really defines them and their future in a deep way.
Cool. Anything that I haven't asked you yet that you want to talk about?
I was curious a few years back, personally for me, what my most important impacts on the planets were. So I researched it a bit, and there was a study by the Union of Concerned Scientists which rated the impacts that individuals had on the environment. And the number one impact we have is through food and fiber. Because agriculture and everything that's involved in it, and fishing, is the number impact we're having on the planet as a whole. Second comes transportation, cars, planes, and so on. And third comes energy use through home heating and appliances and so on. So really there's only three things you need to think about in order to reduce your individual impact on the planet. It's what you eat, it's where you go and how you get there, and it's where and how you live and how you use energy. That's it. That's the most important impacts. And that's pretty manageable. Those are things you can actually keep track of. And trying to, every day, minimize that impact you're having on the planet a little bit more, and hopefully giving something back in terms of how you spend your time, how you spend your money, and how you contribute to a healthier planet rather than a planet that's increasingly being compromised.
Awesome.
Yeah. No, to me that's really that concept of, you need to kind of balance the books, and for everything you take you need to give something back, has become a really fundamental concept. Because we're so used to just thinking, like children, everything is provided somehow magically by us, and what we take doesn't have any consequences. And it has consequences. We see it all around, and I see it particularly in the ocean, but it's the same on land. And we're becoming conscious of this, and this affects the way we conduct ourselves individually and collectively. So there is this group called the Pachamama Alliance, which works with a group of South American natives who believe that the Western world is stuck in what they call the wrong dream. So it's called awakening the dreamer, changing the dream. The idea is that we're in this dream of that having more will make us more complete and happier, and that it's really the wrong way of, it doesn't make us happier, it doesn't make us more whole, it makes us more alienated from ourselves and from the planet, and that we kind of have to wake up out of that dream and really change the culture of how we perceive ourselves and perceive the planet.
Cool. I really like that concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because you almost feel like when you're in a dream,
yes,
you're in something that's negative, and you stay in it. You never leave it.
Right. Yes. It's kind of reinforcing itself, because as you do it, you become unhappier, right? And then you need to do more of it in order to try to get out of it. And so it's this self-reinforcing feedback. And when I look at the humongous homes that people build, the giant cars they drive, the more exotic locations they have to fly to, the more stuff they need to accumulate, it is like a bad dream, really. And maybe it is as simple as just deciding to wake up out of that dream and look at reality.
Yeah, it's pretty beautiful if you stop and think about it.
Well, to me, there's when I look at what's happening to the planet and to us as people, it's almost like it creates a pain inside, and so a lot of what I do is trying to diminish that pain by trying to change the way we think and conduct ourselves.
You're balancing the books by, you got the pain, so you're doing something about it.
Well, that's part of what I try to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Is that the main thing what's the main thing that motivates you in all this?
I think I'm just in love with life, and I want life on this planet to continue and people being part of it. and it's inconceivable to me that that should end, or that the life of future generations become unbearable. And I think we really have to decide now whether we which road we're going to take.
Yeah, it seems to me like we're at a total, well, like now's the time. The information in the public's reached a critical threshold where people, like I tell people about this movie. It's a movie about how humans are going to survive the next 100 years. 75% of them throw a comment back at me right away, like, yeah, right, or like, good luck with that, or like, oh
Okay.
yeah, we're screwed.
Yeah.
Like, everybody knows where we're going.
Oh, you know what? The truth is, nobody knows where we're going. I've really learned that. Nobody has a good idea what the future will look like. We have glimpses, we can extrapolate trends, but to actually know what our future will look like, I don't believe we can say that today, because it's so up in the air right now. This so depends on the choices we take today. It depends on how the planet's reacting to what we're doing to it, what kind of feedback loops, say, the climate system is engaged in, and really, we don't know. It's an incredibly uncertain world, that I do know. How it will look tomorrow, I have very little clue, but I know that what I do today can change the course of events, and that's true for everybody. But fundamentally, we don't know where we're heading.
That's awesome. Really appreciate that, because what that gives people, the audiences, is like, there is a picture that says we're in deep trouble.
Right.
And a lot of people are going to shut off.
Yeah.
So we throw the positive in there to try to say, no, look, but we've had revolutions in the past and we've turned around these things. But then we fundamentally don't know.
We fundamentally don't know. And you know, this is like, I'm studying global change. This is what I'm interested in. I would love to know where we're heading. I would love to have a good prediction of the future. But we're at a turning point, and that's what a crossroads is about. It goes in all these different directions, and you fundamentally don't know where you're going to end up until you've made that choice. And we haven't made that choice yet.
Yeah, time to choose.
Time to choose.